me just start by asking real quickly, what was your takeaways or takeaway from the video? Was it helpful to watch the video? Yeah.
One thing I think that he didn't really talk about, and I think just like for simplification purposes, but like especially when you're talking about the shoulder, like the humerus slides down. So if you don't get that good slide down, then you're going to get that compression sooner. If you have good rotator cuff, if you're getting that slide down, then you have more range of motion. So there's still variability within each joint too, like with the compression. So.
Definitely. And I hope that this afternoon will fill in some of the gaps from that video. It's not comprehensive, but I think it outlines some very critical concepts for yoga practitioners and yoga teachers to understand. That not every body is designed the same. One thing that somewhere in that video I couldn't locate, I think I can take this off actually. Un momento, por favor. So, I know, yes, I think so. Wait a minute, what's going on? He shows somewhere in that video this is called your femur bone, and this is your femoral head, okay? The ball of the ball and socket of your hip joint. And I forget if it falls, I guess it falls into the category of proportion. There's an angle. So this one almost appears to come straight over this ball of the femoral head over from the femur. And I'm not sure, yes, okay. This is called the greater trochanter. Okay, that's not something you're gonna have to memorize, but it'll be relevant to you. Let's real quickly, before I go any further, just flip to the introduction page, which is page number 7 in your Key Muscles of Hatha Yoga Anatomy book. And that second paragraph, I think, is really what we need to understand here. It's not necessary to memorize hundreds of muscles and bones to experience the benefits of applying science to yoga. What is necessary is the functional understanding of a manageable number of key anatomic structures in their settings as they relate to Hatha Yoga. Knowledge of these structures can be applied immediately to optimize our practice, break through blockages, and avoid injury. So that's basically what we're trying to do here. Back to my example. So this greater trochanter, which is the outer, is actually the widest part of your body. We think of it normally as the hips, but you can see here how the greater trochanter on this femur on the right side here of Stan is actually a little bit wider than the iliac. This is the crest of the iliac right here. This is usually the widest part, and in your body is actually part of your femur, just a little bit lower than the pelvis. Well, this femur head comes straight over from that trochanter. And he shows one where it's angled. This ball is like over here in relation to it. And so that rotation is going to have a big, big impact as well on whether or not our feet naturally turn out or turn in, or it's easier to keep them parallel. So there's all sorts of little factors like that. I'll put Stan back together here. And it's interesting that we named this skeleton Stan because I believe this is actually, I don't know that it's 100% precise, but I believe this is a little bit more of a female's proportions and body structure. I feel like it might have said that when I bought this skeleton, but I'm not 100% certain.
Pelvic arch, is that wide or narrow?
Wide.
I think it's wider for the birth canal.
Right, like that on the skeleton. 90 degrees or greater than 90 degrees?
Right here? Is that what we're talking about, right here?
Mm-hmm. Like the V shape underneath.
Yeah, I'd say that's less than 90. Maybe just a minute. Thank you for that. Okay, let's flip over to the next page in your anatomy book, pages 8 and 9. So we're going to go through the first section of this book together, basically. This is going to give us some language. Some of these terms are a little bit, anatomical, and we don't generally use in terms of yoga instruction. Nonetheless, it's helpful to know these terms, and these are terms on the left side here that you are going to need to know for your final exam. but it's going to be helpful so that you and I and all of us can communicate about the body in terms of anatomy and in terms of what's happening. So the first two terms here, these are the locations of structures on the body, are medial and lateral. Medial is closer to the midline of the body. The midline, dissecting line, and lateral is away from the midline. Now we usually need 2 points to be able to understand these terms. So my chest is medial to my upper arm bone, or my humerus. Okay. My humerus is lateral to my sternum. That makes sense? Okay. Proximal and distal. Now these are similar but different. Proximal is closer to the trunk or midline, whereas distal is away from the trunk or midline. Okay, the shoulder is proximal, the hand is distal. They look like they might be the same distance from the midline. Does that make sense? In terms of medial-lateral, they're probably about the same medial-lateral, but the hand is further, it's more distant. And all it would be is raising my arm to very clearly see that, which would also make my hand more lateral now than medial. Superior and inferior. Superior towards the top, inferior towards the bottom. My knee is inferior compared to my hip. My foot is inferior compared to just about everything else. Okay. Anterior and posterior. Give yourself compassion if you are confused on any of these. I used to think for years before I really studied this stuff, backwards on these kind of things. But anterior is the front of your body. Posterior is towards the back. Okay. This is your posterior, right? Back here. The back is posterior to the chest. The chest is anterior to the back. Those are most likely the ones we're going to use, plus the final one. The next one, ventral and dorsal, I don't use a whole lot ever. But ventral is literally on the front of the body and dorsal is on the back. Thankfully, I like dolphins, and so I always heard dorsal fin, so okay, it's on the back. Okay. The lumbar region, the lumbar is dorsal, it's on the back. The abdomen is ventral. Again, I don't use those as much as I use anterior and posterior. I do use superficial and deep. These are good to know too, particularly in terms of different muscles, how they overlay one another. What's closer into the middle of our body, what's closer to the skin. Okay, superficial is towards the skin, whereas deep is inside the body. Our abdominal organs are deep. The abdominal muscles are more superficial. They're closer to the skin than those abdominal organs. Make sense? Okay. We'll move on then. That makes sense. Feel free to ask questions anytime. I'd like now to skip ahead in the book, actually, and go from page 10 to page 44. I'm going to come back to page 10. So it's a little bit more applied, okay? Movements. Movements happen there's 6 basic movements of the body, and they take place in 3 different planes. It's a pretty good image. I'll help explain it to you. The coronal plane, as if the body were dissected front to back. Okay. Movements in this plane are out this way. So following that green plane there, all the movements would go parallel with that green plane. So the movements are, anybody know what this one is? Paul really mentioned it a couple times. Abduction and adduction. Add, to bring to the middle or closer into the body. Abduct, like you're kidnapping, abducting someone, you take it away. Okay? Moving the extremities towards the midline, adduction. Moving extremities away from the midline, adduction. The sagittal plane, this is the one that dissects the body right through the midline, okay? Now our movements are going to be parallel with what is in that book, the reddish grid or plane, right? So the movements are this way and this way. This movement, anybody have a guess? And? Good, yes. Flexion at my hip, extension at my hip. Flexion at my shoulder, extension at my shoulder. Okay, make sense? I can also flex and extend my knee. That's extension of the knee. Might have been confusing because I just did flexion and I went forward, but I was just raising my knee so I could bend it. This is obviously extension at my knee, right? Everybody agree? Okay, and flexion at my knee. Okay, now if I let the thigh hang straight down, extension, flexion, flexion. It's still in that same plane, right through here. Okay. Transverse plane, this is where the body's dissected but kind of in half top to bottom. Everything here is going to be rotation. So we twist and we have medial rotation towards the midline or lateral rotation. This corresponds to the extremities again. I'm rotating this way, that's going to be called medial. I'm rotating my leg this way, again they call it medial. What we refer to it as in yoga is what? Internal and external. Internal rotation, external rotation. We primarily talk about this with the legs because we have categories of poses which we're going to dive deeper into in the upcoming weeks. Externally rotated standing poses, so how I externally rotated my legs a little bit. And internally rotated poses, which all tend to have a similar shape to this, generally speaking. Although eagle pose would also have a little bit internal. Interesting note about eagle pose. It's one of few, very few, maybe the only standing pose that has what movement? It's in the coronal plane of my legs and my hips. What's that? Abduction. What's this? Adduction. There's very few poses in yoga, particularly standing. I'm thinking this is the only standing that we abduct the legs. Even in Utkatasana, we're not really abducting like that. We're pretty much neutral. So that's abducting right there. Again, I don't stand in the yoga class and say, okay everyone, abduct your right leg over top of your left leg. That's not usually how we communicate. But nonetheless, knowing what's happening is helpful. Yeah?
Adduction. Isn't that when you pull it together, correct?
Right.
Did I say it backwards?
I'm just trying to make sure that I understand correctly. I thought
Yes.
adduction was a way.
Abduct. A-B. Duct. Is
So
a way.
when you do this.
This should be
that's
adduction. If I said it backwards, I apologize.
No, I was just making sure. I
Yeah.
thought maybe.
Yeah, this would be adduction.
Okay.
Because it's moving towards the midline?
Right.
Yeah.
So, okay, so I'm reading it.
Yeah, so if I took my leg, right, if I took it out that way, I'd be abducting it. Now I'm adducting it because I'm taking it to the midline. I'm taking it past midline. So it's in adduction. Add
Maybe it's in both.
A-D-D. Do what?
Could you be both? Well, because you're bringing it back across, you're kind of going out again, no? I don't know. Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't
Yeah, I think you're over.
I'm sorry. I'm never going to pass things.
Yeah, this is just adduction because we're taking that leg towards midline. Yes, we are taking it past. So it's like
That's the trick.
how far can a dog go into the woods? Halfway because the other half's out, but. Yeah, okay, let's keep it simple. So let's do a little pop quiz. Melissa, I am doing what movement where?
You're extending your arm.
At the
Shoulder.
correct. Very good. Randy, I am doing what movement where?
You are extending.
That's okay.
And you just changed it?
I just changed it so he wasn't confused.
On the coronal plane?
This movement is from this joint. What joint am I moving from? Hip. This is flexion. This is extension. Okay. Flexion, extension at the hip. Okay. Flexion at the hip, extension at the hip.
I was looking at the knee.
Yeah, you're looking, so that's why I bent the knee to try and make you, yes, my leg was extended, but,
Is flexion always forward?
At the shoulder, at the hip, it's forward. At the knee, it depends on our orientation. That's where orientation comes in, right? When we're laying down or what. So yes, if I raise my arm forward, I flexed at my shoulder. If I raise my leg forward, I flexed at my hip. Now I'm in a yoga pose. What's the movement here? It'll probably help you if I change my orientation, huh? Flexion at the hip. Get it? Extension at the knee, flexion at the hip. Okay? I'm still flexed at the hip here because my leg is in front of me.
So the back leg is extended.
And the back leg was extended at the hip. The back knee is extended, the front knee is in flexion. Okay. A couple more. Ernest, I am doing what movement where?
Abducting your shoulder.
Abducting AB, abducting at the shoulder. Mo, I am doing what movement where?
Adducting at the shoulder.
Correct, adducting at the shoulder. Taylor, I am doing what movement where?
Well, you're at your waist, your hips are twisting away, and I have no idea. Sorry.
I'm doing axial rotation.
I can break that down.
Yeah, axial rotation at the spine, at the axis. Okay. It's maybe a little bit of rotation there at the hips too. Wait a minute, I got to you. Connie, I am doing. So this is anatomical neutral, everybody. This is like what's the Leonardo da Vinci guy?
Yeah.
What is it?
Vitruvian Man.
Vitruvian Man, right? Okay, so he's doing all this, right? But essentially, when you come to neutral, you're actually here with your palms facing just a little bit forward, which is how we practice mountain pose. Okay, so honey, I'm doing what movement where, so everybody sees it.
You're rotating?
Mm-hmm. Paul really had to do this to get his palm flat.
Outward, but that's not the right word.
Internal. This is internal. So I'm turning it in towards the midline.
Okay. Because I was thinking because the back part was moving out, to me it was.
And it can get confusing in the arm a little bit. Okay, but this would be what they call in the book medial or internal rotation at the, where am I rotating?
No.
Closer to the axis.
Yeah. Oh, my shoulder. Oh,
The shoulder.
okay, I don't get
The
this.
rotation is at the shoulder. That's all right, I'm gonna help. Okay. Even though you see this, where's the rotation happening? Here. So when we see students and they're like this, yeah. So just pause on it for a second. What we see is like what Paul Green talked about in the video. The tail wagging the dog. Our eye as yoga teachers is going to be drawn to this funky hand, wrist thing that's going on here. But probably if we address it closer to the axis and get the correct rotation, it'll probably look a little bit better. And if it still looks weird, then we can work that out too. Now the arm is confusing. Everyone take your arms to your side and bend your elbows. It's the opposite of whatever your elbows do. So if my elbows come in, I am externally rotating.
Ooh.
Mm-hmm. And if my elbows go out, I am internally rotating because it's the rotation here. Feel your shoulder. Maybe close your eyes and feel what's actually happening at your shoulder. This is external. This is internal. So if I am in extended side angle pose and I want the pinky finger to turn down, it's all kinds of confusing now because it's over my head, but I am internally rotating.
Because it starts with.
No, sorry, I'm
Yeah,
externally rotating. I'm externally rotating because it's actually happening.
That's a good way to think of it too.
Thankfully, I know right now you might be like, wait a minute, I'm reaching a point here. Breathe. Because we don't speak to students too often in this kind of language. this is for your own understanding biomechanically what's happening. Okay? This is in some point in time, early on I assume, in anatomy, someone had to determine what was what. Because you could argue that as my thumb rotates in, well, something's rotating out, the palm of your hand is facing out now, why is that not external rotation? At some point in time they just had to say, one's one, one's the other. Because we gotta have it that way. Yeah, internal rotation, external rotation. Okay. As I internally rotate, my foot's gonna wing out with my knee bent. As I externally rotate, looks my foot comes kind of inward with my knee bent. But nonetheless, internal rotation, which makes a lot of sense when you're standing more legs straight, because you'll feel that spiraling in, and I have to kind of exaggerate it to really communicate it. Maybe it's easier here. External, internal. We can really see the foot as a dial, it's a lever. Hand from anatomical neutral, internal, thumb turns in, external, thumb turns out. Maybe that helps. Let's look at the next page. This is just giving us a language, okay? In reality, and especially in yoga postures, movement rarely is described simply. Complex movements involve many joints moving in various ways. Open and closed chain movements, as diagrammed on page 47. Essentially, whether or not something is in a fixed type position, like the arm in Warrior 1, or Warrior 2 rather, is open chain, because you can move this arm freely up, down, external, internal, so on. Whereas number 2, the thigh, because it's connected to the knee, connected to the foot, which is on the floor, it's not so easy to manipulate. Can it be manipulated? Yes, but it's in a closed chain because it is fixed with the floor there. Their description is movements in which the distal end of the moving limb, so that means distal further away from our midline or from our axis, are fixed is a closed chain movement. So here's an example too. What's open chain? My top arm. Everything else in terms of my bottom arm and feet are closed chain. Now, is anything in open chain? Everything's in a closed chain. Even though it's not on the ground, I've now connected it to something else, so it's closed chain. Again, we don't spend a ton of time talking about open and closed chain, but just an understanding of this gives you, okay, something is more free versus something being a little bit more connected. That's what that's about. Let's go back to page 10 now. Let me know if I'm moving too fast, please. You don't think of it this way, now you will, hopefully. Bone is dynamic living tissue. Not like Stan's bone here, which is some sort of hard plastic or whatever. Okay, this is living tissue that obviously forms our structural framework. Our bone's mass is composed of organic and inorganic material, including calcium salts, connective tissue, cells, and blood vessels. So it's pretty neat. And what happens when, as we age generally, is some of that bone density begins to deteriorate, causing a condition known as what? Osteoporosis. Yoga is very, very helpful in slowing, if not preventing altogether, osteoporosis. Very, very healthy. Some of the things that Paul Greer was talking about, even just mild compression and weight bearing on our joints, is very, very helpful for keeping bone density. So yoga is very, very good in helping prevent that, which is why I think it's gradually becoming even more and more widely accepted in elderly populations. Some shapes of various bones here, and as you can see from Stan and your own knowledge of the skeleton system, there's quite diverse shapes of bones. I mean, the scapula is a very interesting bone shape here. This triangle with somewhat of a spine back here, and then that acromion process we learned about. We have the vertebral bodies, which are like round, but then with these fins hanging off. When we have kind of a common shaped bone that you would see in the comic book, right? There's the femur and the humerus. This is the humerus, this is the femur. Calcaneus, there, that's your heel bone, which has this nice protruding shelf to help provide balance. Imagine if you didn't have that sticking off the back, how your balance would be. It just came straight down, right? Amazing, really, if you think about it, the technology of our human anatomy. Okay, moving on. Sanskrit word for yoga or a yoga pose is asana, which translates, it means seat or posture, a comfortable or effortless position. Yoga postures approach effortlessness when we align the long axis of the bones with the direction of gravity. This decreases the muscular force needed to maintain our posture. You can see the image of Uttanasana, which they spell with an extra H for those of you keeping track. If we were to simply rock the weight towards our heels, where's the pelvis in that image going to go? Forward. We rock the weight towards our heels. Back. Now, I have a lot more muscular effort actually trying to keep my balance here. You see how my toes have lifted? And I'm engaging around my lower legs just to try and keep myself balanced here. Whereas if I align more parallel with the force of gravity, it actually helps me find ease in this pose. Does that make sense? That's what that image is talking about there. Likewise, when we're sitting in a pose like Sukhasana, if we start to slouch, it actually creates strain in the core muscles around the front and the back. Whereas if we align, the spine is not a straight line, as you see. We'll talk more about the spine here in just a minute. But nonetheless, the overall structure of the spine, if we align that parallel with the forces of gravity, then we use its supporting curvature, which are like arches, to help reinforce itself. Some fundamental bones here. I'll go through them briefly. A lot of these you may be aware of. Some of them may be relatively new. Generally, I think it's best to refer to them in their English or layperson names. So the clavicle, which is the first bone listed there. A lot of people may know that one because they may have broken it or know someone who's broken it. I think it's the #1 most broken bone in the human body. Yeah, the clavicle. This is your collarbone. So generally, I refer to this in yoga instruction as your collarbone. Widen across the chest, spreading the collarbone. This is the type of language or cue I might get. As Paul Greeley mentioned, the clavicles or collarbones are connected to the scapula. Try to raise your scapula and not your collarbone. You can't. Depress the scapula without depressing the collarbone. You can't. They go up and down together. Scapula is the next one on that image. This is the shoulder blade, or shoulder blades. That's the way I would generally refer to them. Again, often people might be familiar with scapula. You guys all are now, but in a yoga class, I don't know what the percentage of people is that would know if I said take your scapula down your back, how many of them would be like, right away get that. Some of them might get it in a few moments. Better to say shoulder blades. The sternum, and this is one that I use in reference, I think a fair amount of yoga teachers do reference and use in class quite often, and sometimes I do call it sternum, other times breastbone. But this is a very obvious central point. It's medial, of course, and it gives us a good reference point. Maybe I'm spreading out from it. Maybe I'm lengthening the center of it up away from the navel, and so I do use sternum or breastbone quite often. The upper arm bone is your humerus. It's pretty funny, right? Again, upper arm bone, probably better to say than externally rotate your humerus. You really want to confuse your yoga class. Say raise your arm up over your head, externally rotate your humerus. Everyone's going to be like, what am I supposed to do? I don't know what's happening. Okay, the radius and the ulna, we probably have a good understanding a little bit from the video. The ulna comes down the pinky side and the radius rotates like a radius around the circle, rotates over and around the ulna. So this comes down to the thumb side. When we pronate and supinate, that's the movement here, we will either flatten the palms, maybe we're in a forearm plank position, we'll be pronating, or we'll be supinating. Supine position is when we lay on our back. The palms would be face up, naturally. So that's one way to help you maybe remember supination and pronation. The ilium I mentioned here, the pelvis. This is the iliac crest right here. These are good points, easy points to find on someone. If you wanted to come over to someone who probably is like maybe 50 to 60% of your body mass and lift them up, you just grab them by their ilium and carry them around, just like I lifted stand up. That's where you want to hold them. I got familiar with these 2 points a long time ago because I used to work as an outdoor gear salesperson at a great outdoor provision company, actually. Before they were up here in Virginia, they have one out in Virginia Beach now, but I worked for them, and they were just a North Carolina company. And when you get a backpack, like a backpacker's backpack, you want the waistband to sit on the ilium. You don't want that weight to be bearing down on your shoulders. Imagine carrying all that gear wherever you're camping, it's all coming down on your shoulders. You're gonna have a very sore shoulder and back the next day. You want it resting on the ilium. That's why they have a big waistband, and that's where you want to rest. And just like I lifted it up, that's a boom, right there. You got somewhat of a shelf, and you're carrying it, the load on your lower body where you have bigger bone structure and bigger muscle groups. You're gonna notice that here as we go down, right? The bone structures get bigger because this is where we're bearing weight. The load generally of our axis is on the lower body. The sacrum, Megan was talking about that yesterday when I was here in terms of child's pose and child's pose assist, and I imagine it came up again for downward dog, is this broad triangular shape, and the triangle is inverted when we're oriented in this direction, upright, right here at the base of your spine. And it's fused vertebra, so in the spine we have C1 through C7, then we have T1 through T12. All 12 of thoracic vertebra attached to what? Ribs. And then we have L1 through L5, lumbar spine here. And then S1 through is it S5? Is that right? Yeah, that's what I thought. And then we have the coccyx, the tailbone. Okay, I'm going to circle back to the spine. No, let's stay on this one. Let's stay on this one. So let me revisit that and see them from this direction. Cervical vertebra, thoracic vertebra, lumbar vertebra, and sacrum and coccyx. Page 19. Spinal curves. View them from the side. Kyphotic curve is a convex curve, and a lordotic curve is a concave curve. Again, I geek out on this stuff. I've come to know what kyphotic and lordotic mean, but I didn't probably know that for the first 8 years I was a yoga teacher. Basically, the lumbar spine and the cervical, this is lumbar, this is cervical, are in lordotic curves. Okay, so they curve this way relative to his orientation, whereas the thoracic curves back the other way. Okay, so are you guys getting this? Do I need to draw it? He's curved enough. Okay, so this curve, this banana curve here is lordotic. This curve here is kyphotic, and this is lordotic. Some of you might know the answer to this. Someone who has a very, what they call sway back, very accentuated lumbar curve. You might know this condition that I think happens in like younger females, probably most commonly. Huh? Not scoliosis.
Lordosis?
Lordosis. lordosis. And this could be a condition that we could address yogically to tone the thigh bones, to tone the thigh muscles, press the thigh bones back, pull the belly up, and elongate that lower back area to help alleviate, if not the symptoms of lordosis, which would be strain in the low back, if not alleviate those symptoms, maybe even correct the condition. But this is a lordotic curve, this is a lordotic curve, this is a kyphotic curve.
The kyphotic, you see those people with the.
Yes, so and often in advanced age, more often than not, is we have kyphosis, which is this advanced kyphotic curve in the upper back. Again, yoga can, if not help just simply alleviate some symptomology, help correct that issue. I would work with that student one-on-one and have them lay on a couple blocks. Chances are it wouldn't be like one block under the chest and one block under the head, because they're so kyphotic. I might have to prop up their head with more than I'm putting underneath their back, but nonetheless I would try to help them do postures like this. Supported postures are really, really good so the musculature can release around the skeletal structure. But I would also do some active poses where the muscles are engaging to work that structure back too. Good question. So that's called kyphosis. This is lordosis. And then we have, yes, scoliosis, where the spine is in a rotation. Usually a little bit more slight than I'm demonstrating here. Scoliosis is on the next page there, page 20. It's a lateral deviation and rotational deformity of the spine. The most common form is idiopathic, meaning it's without identifiable cause. Other forms include congenital and neuromuscular scoliosis. Studies that suggest that idiopathic scoliosis is related to hormonal factors, including the level of melatonin produced. This form of scoliosis also has a hereditary component. When the magnitude of the scoliotic curve progresses beyond 20 degrees, there's a risk of continued progression after skeletal maturity. And very large scoliotic curves can impact respiration by restricting the rib cage. Scoliosis also affects the pelvic and shoulder girdles, as illustrated here. We'll see that tilting of the pelvic girdle, creating a perception of limb length discrepancy, one leg shorter than the other. Similarly, one arm may appear shorter than the other. Scoliosis affects the bone, cartilage, and muscles of the spine. Muscles on the convex side of a curve become chronically shortened when compared with those on the concave side. Yoga postures aid to counteract this process by stretching the shortened muscles. I have it in my notes somewhere. I don't know if I have, because I got these from Mark Stevens, who is visiting us in just a couple weeks when I did advanced training with him. The percentage of scoliosis that goes to the right versus the left is a very, very high percentage, like 80% or something like that, goes one direction. I can't remember if it's right or left, but it's pretty fascinating that like 80% of idiopathic scoliosis goes one direction or the other. So in terms of working with that, twists are good, but we need to focus on lengthening. So if I'm already a little bit twisted like this, scoliosis, and I'm probably exaggerating more than most cases that you would see, and I go into a pose like a revolved triangle or even a seated twist. Maybe I'll do a seated twist. I feel like what's the guy in Hunchback of Notre Dame? I feel like
Quasimodo.
Yeah, I feel like Quasimodo. Okay, so I'm already naturally like this, and when I twist this way, I'm going to exasperate the condition a little bit. So when I twist that way, I'm going to actually encourage this student to really lift and lengthen and not twist as deep as they can go. Okay, and then I really want to emphasize, so this person, I might have them look a little different side to side, whereas most students, I'm going to have them generally look about the same on both sides. This is going to be the hard way for them. This is away from their natural curved tendency. This is the hard way for them, but I'm going to really want them to try and work that twist, because it's going to lengthen all the muscles that are already tightened and shortened, while engaging some of the muscles that will help them come back into support. So extreme conditions are always advisable to try and work one-on-one whenever possible. If you have an extreme condition of something, that's the best way to work with that student. That might not always be the case. It's not a perfect world out there. It's not a perfect world in here either. Where someone comes to you, they have a pre-extreme condition, they can't afford it, or they just came with their friend that day. You have to work within that moment. Okay? Do the best that you can with what you know. And understand that it's not your job to go and try and fix this one person when you have a group of people to work with. You know? Okay, so you might remember, okay, God, we talked about scoliosis in training. I see that your scoliosis has caused you to tilt a little bit this way. All right, so I want you to focus on lengthening this side of the body today. Really focus on every pose and lengthening and trying getting even through your shoulders. When you twist, you know, lengthen and lengthen. And then maybe twist a little further on this side. And that's probably enough direction that you're going to give that student. Are you freaked out yet? Okay, good. All right, good. Did we jump ahead? No, we're moving through. Okay. Joints. Next page. 22, 23. Already spoken of ball and socket when I pulled out Stan's ball from the side. So there's two examples of this. Obviously the head. Where else? Shoulder. Yep. Movement here. We got rotation. We got the flexion and extension, remember? And we also have abduction and adduction. Yep. Hinge joint. A couple examples here where we got elbow and knee. Exactly. I like that. What movements are here? What movements are here? Flexion and extension. What about rotation? A little bit when it's flexed. Like at the knee we talked about. When it is flexed, we got a little rotation here. It depends on, of course, as we saw from the video, each body structure. But not when it's extended. That's bad. That's when you see those, you know, like a bad injury. Yeah.
But can't you externally and internally rotate from the hip?
Yes, I mentioned rotation. Yeah, but internal and external rotation at the ball and socket joints. Ball and socket
But
rotation,
not hinges.
not hinges. Minimally.
Okay.
Minimally,
Alright.
but generally just flexion extension. I had to watch a video. I used to be a snowboard instructor for many seasons, and I had to watch a video. Although it's not as common as snowboarding because you're in a closed chain, if you will, fixed to your board, both feet, where skis independent, and they feet pop out. Okay. One of the common injuries in skiing is torn ACL because skiers will fall down on their bottom, be like this. Their skis are still moving, and they'll try and push back up because their knee is twisted, and then they try and push down, pops that ACL. Very common injury in skiing. Ligaments, which we're coming up on, they connect bone to bone. You do need to know that. Ligaments connect bone to bone. This is connective tissue. Tendons connect what?
Muscle to bone.
Muscle to bone. The way I remember this is Achilles tendon. I think that's the most famous tendon, if you will, most well known, which is attaches your calf muscles, or your gastrocs, gastrocnemius, down to the calcaneus, the heel bone. Connects the muscle to the bone. Muscle to bone, tendon.
So tendon connects muscle to bone.
Muscle to bone. Ligaments connect bone to bone. Good. Like the ligaments in your knee, the ACL I just mentioned, which is like a rubber band basically that goes across right there, just like this little metal piece does. Right here, these are called condyloids of your femur. They're almost like little round tires that sit on the shelf of the tibia plateau. And so the ligaments here are just going across to one another, and front to back here in the knee. We have the MCL, the medial collateral ligament, the LCL, the lateral collateral ligament. What do you think you know about those two from just what you've already learned today?
What's on the outside? What's on the inside?
Exactly. Medial is towards the midline and lateral is towards the outside. Exactly. And the anterior is going to be towards the front. Exactly. So the anterior cruciate ligament is towards the front and goes across the condyloid to condyloid. I like the image on page 23 of your meniscus, or your menisci, which shows again those condyloids I was just talking about, those bulbous protrusions on the bottom of that femur, and how they rest on these little disc-like pads called your meniscus.
Torn both mine, just,
You have torn both yours.
so surgeries on both knees, yeah.
They're good. Please feel free to add.
I need all the one. It's fun.
Taylor has so many injuries that she's going to be
I do
so.
my best.
She's going to be a wealth of knowledge
I'm trying to be an athlete.
in the anatomy component of your
Was
training.
that
I mean,
from
where you're
tennis
the-
too?
Huh?
Was that from tennis too?
No, cycling and running.
Right.
I don't
Yeah, so
recommend taking up running when you're fighting.
these are basically like little pads chakra bars. And from my understanding, you only get 2 of them, or I guess, is it 4 of them your whole life? 2 per leg? Okay. And someone told me in the last training, and I think I believe this, and verified it, but someone told it to me, so it's got to be true. That there's nothing that has been produced man-made, artificially, that can replace your meniscus.
You just gotta get a hold of
That's
the
absolutely true. There's not much blood flow to it either.
Yeah.
And it's, well, just, you want to hear about
Yeah, please tell us more about
Okay,
the
well,
meniscus.
well, mine were torn and sticking out a bit, and based on and I could feel one when I walked, it popped. And so he basically trimmed it and then went in and cleaned out some operative stuff I had going on. But, a younger person, they might try to repair it because there's not a lot of blood flow to it, it's hard. It can become, I mean, it's
Because
hard
blood
it's hard to
flow
do.
is imperative to tissue rebuilding.
So I went ahead and had mine trimmed because like based on your age, you just want to get it done, get moving. But a younger person, you might try to save it, and sometimes it can not work. So, like you said, once it's done, and then you've got bone on bone, and then eventually you can need a new place.
And that doesn't feel good.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah,
that's a little
exactly.
bit that I know.
How do you tear it?
I think just from working out, over time, overuse.
Yeah, I think overuse.
Yeah.
And so you can see how running would just keep putting pressure on this meniscus and kind of wear it down over time.
That's exactly why I don't triple jump.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, I did that in high school a few times. I was good at it, but I was like, you know what? I want my knees. So
Yeah.
It's a lot of impact and a very forceful. I mean,
Yeah.
forceful for an athletic, but nonetheless, you're applying a lot of force, down into these joint forces. Which is what the next page shows: joint reaction forces. So think of this way: the body basically likes the Vesuvian man anatomical neutral position. If we line it up well, like we do in mountain pose, when you finally align mountain pose, doesn't it generally feel pretty good? You're like, yeah, all right, this is good, right? The body likes that because the pull of gravity is pulling the joints exactly how they were designed to be stressed, if you will. Now, applying other stresses to them, which is what yoga asanas do, apply stresses, can be healthy too. But just know that these reactions are going to be different. So look at the hip. That's what the image is in page 24. That left square image is the articulation of your hip when it's in the standing leg of tree pose, which is essentially like mountain pose. Maybe you leaned a little bit to compensate. And what it's showing, what's highlighted, that kind of bluish or pale gray blue, is how much surface area of the acetabulum, that's the socket that's receiving the femoral head, how there's a lot of articulation. It's like pocketed in there really nicely, right? Whereas the externally rotated and abducted hip of the raised leg in tree pose, you can see how there's now this gap or space in the joint. That's not a bad thing per se, particularly because there's no weight on it. And then it's showing the knee of the standing leg, how the joint forces are just going straight down, basically onto the meniscus, which is a good thing. If I bent that knee, it's actually worse for it. Like bend it drastically. A little micro bend is going to be okay. but if I bend it drastically, you can see how that would apply, the condyloid would kind of roll back and apply more pressure on the back of the meniscus. In tree pose, that's probably not going to be too dangerous, but if I were triple jumping and landed that way, right, it could be bad.
Yeah, I'm gonna go to the hospital after that.
Yeah. Here is the fun image on page 25 of our knee rotation. So we can get that extra rotation from the hip, and we're like, yes, I really want to get lotus. I've got to get my foot up there, and I'm twisting from the knee. Death. Destruction. It would happen right there. It would probably pop the LCL, because this is the medial. It would probably stretch and extend that lateral collateral ligament too much until it might tear, which none of us want. So the next page shows ligaments, which I already mentioned, connects bone to bone. These are fibrous connective tissue structures that link one bone to another at the joint. I skipped ahead a little bit at joints, you guys, sorry. We covered hinge and ball and socket, but I failed to mention, if you go back to page 22, compressive, which are the discs of your spine, which they absorb a little bit of shock, and they kind of disperse all the force. If you were to step or jump and land, it kind of distributes that force in all directions. So that's a compressive joint. And we also have, it doesn't show it, I don't believe, in this book, somewhat surprisingly, is the cartilaginous joint. No, sorry. These are cartilaginous joints. Cartilage here through the spine. This is a fibrous joint. Yeah, I just decapitated standing. Paying attention. This is a fibrous joint. Right here, connecting these hemispheres of the skull.
This is where our soft spot comes
I
together.
was saying, is that?
Uh-huh.
I was okay. Cool.
All right, everyone, make some movement at the fibrous joint at the top of your head. This is an immobile joint. The other joints that are mobile, this looks wrong. Yeah, I do have to stick a nail right through the top of his head to get that off. All right. These are called synovial joints, the joints that have movement. S-Y-N-O-V-I-A-L, synovial. These joints produce, synovial fluid that allow the joint movement. What did you have to say to it?
I was asking, you said that they're the joints that have movement.
Yes.
Right, okay.
The joints that have movement are synovial joints. And these are the most common joints of the body. Most common are synovial joints. And the most mobility, as I mentioned. Technically, if we were to go even deeper, and I'll just mention them, we already talked about ball and socket, we already talked about hinge. There's called the saddle joint. At the base of your thumb, this joint here has flexion and extension. Flexion and extension. It has adduction and adduction. Circumduction. And same with the condyloid joint at your wrist. It has flexion, extension, adduction, abduction, circumduction. Like you were all of a sudden the king or queen. And it produces a more gliding movement at this joint. Sorry, I forgot about those little extra fibrous collagenous ligaments. Page 28 shows ligaments around the pelvis. And there's a lot of connective tissue around your pelvis. And thus, sometimes the compression, as Paul really talked about here, the radius and ulna probably never make contact, but all the connective tissue and muscle fiber gets squeezed to the point where you can't go any further. And it's not really a tension issue, it's just compression because all that. Like, same thing here sometimes. I may not, depending on my anatomy, I might be able to get my thigh, it's never going to be a bone to bone, but you know, the femur to move to the ribs. But sometimes, back here, for example, I reach my compressive limit, not because I'm tightening my hip flexors, although I slightly am, but because all the connective tissue back here, which we're looking at there on page 28, gets squeezed to the point where it's not going anywhere else, even though I haven't actually made the bone hit the other bone. Shoulder and elbow ligaments on page 30. The rotator cuff. Sits. I don't know why they don't list teres minor on here. I had to pull it out of my mind. Okay. Everyone, this is, I like this stuff. This is applied anatomy. Reach up over your shoulder, doesn't matter, and find the spine of your scapula, this ridge right here. Everyone able to find that? Climb just a finger walk just slightly above it. Massage. This is your supraspinatus, named because it's superior to the spine of your scapula, supraspinatus. This is one of the 4 rotator cuff muscles. Go back to that ridge. Go slightly down and palpate. This is your infraspinatus, inferior to that spine on scapula. This is muscle number 2 of your rotator cuff. Come out from the infraspinatus, which is not shown on this image. I'm gonna have to write Ray Long and be like, dude. This is your teres minor, part of the rotator cuff. One that we cannot touch because it is deeper than your scapula, is the subscapularis. Oh, does it say teres major?
No, I said there's a minor and a major.
Oh, there's a minor.
That's where you were going. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
okay. It's the subscapularis. Those are the 4 muscles of your rotator cuff. I know them as SITS, S-I-T-S. Supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor or major, and subscapularis. As Alan taught me, actually, that's Taylor's husband, who's a doctor, that because there's 4, and he wasn't maybe the only person teaching this, if you tear one, there's still 3 others that can help do the job, keeping your shoulder stable. I don't go advising, oh yeah, you got 3 others, just go tear. However, there are 4 muscles here that do support that. You seem like you had some maybe understanding or experience with rotator cuffs. Anything else that you have to add?
I would say each one still does a different thing.
Does a different thing, yeah.
Like two of them pull the humeral head down, and the other 2 provide more like a compression, like pulling it in. So they don't all do the same
Yeah,
thing,
exactly.
but,
Right, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Everything in the body does something a little bit
Yeah.
different.
But
And-
they do help prevent impingement of the shoulder, so you get more range of motion. If the further the humeral head goes into the socket itself, the more rotation and more flexion you can get.
Mm-hmm. It's good. An impingement of the shoulder, I'm just looking for the page where that would be. It is in here. It's basically compression, but I think it pinches the nerve too in the shoulder area, so it can be very painful. Did you find it, Ernest?
I was looking at the index, but not
when you're doing your physical therapy, can you tell when you've met where the bone is bone issue and not muscular or tendon issue?
So with like passive range of motion, so like, can I touch your shoulder? Is it okay? Like if I am assessing her range of motion and I get to a certain point and it's like a really hard infeel, like that's usually bone to bone, but if it's like kind of squishy feeling, then that's usually more muscular. So like we learn the difference between those two things.
But it would be like, so I would have to touch the person and move them in order to tell if that is as much as they're.
Right, or kind of like he was talking about in the video where they could tell you too, like, oh yeah, I feel the tightness back here, or oh, I just feel like two things hitting together up here. So they could tell you too, depending on what they feel when they do it.
Turn to page 174 in your anatomy book. And keep a pencil or a bookmark back there. And this is the rotator cuff. You can see the very muscles, the little bit better isolation imagery of what we were just looking at. Infraspinatus, supraspinatus, the subscapularis. It's showing the anterior view from the front because it's deeper or underneath of that scapula. Shows the origin and insertion. Origin of the muscle and insertion, both are the attachment points of the muscles to the bone. The origin is the more proximal attachment, and the insertion is the more distal. So that's how they label those. And we haven't gotten to these terms, but while we're looking at it, I flipped to page 178, antagonist and synergist. So muscles have a reciprocal muscle that generally does the opposite joint movement. To flex at my elbow, I engage the bicep. I flex my bicep. To straighten the elbow, to extend the elbow, I engage the tricep. And as the tricep muscle engages, I can feel it on the back of my upper arm here, engaging, the bicep muscle lengthens. This is a concept that we're going to use a lot in yoga. This is how we actively stretch. If I want to actively stretch my bicep, I engage my tricep. So if I want to actively engage my hamstrings, something that's good to do because they're often big and tight, I'm going to tone and engage my quadriceps, as I cued today when we did some of these standing forward pulls. A synergist muscle is a muscle that can do the job of the main muscle, but probably not as efficiently. Kind of like we were just talking about with the rotator cuff. Yeah, again, he doesn't really show the teres minor and major in here. But at the end of this little section, you can see shoulder biomechanics on page 183, and then it's on page 184 where impingement is discussed. And let's just talk about it since we were already working. The subacromial, so now you know what that means, it's below the acromion process. Bursa is a sac-like fluid-filled structure that facilitates the gliding of the rotator cuff under the acromion. Impingement involves compression of the subacromial bursa between the greater tuberosity of the humerus. I'm going to mention the greater tuberosity here. This is the greater tuberosity out here of the humerus and the acromion. This results in obvious shoulder pain. When we contract the infraspinatus, the one that's inferior above the spine of the scapula, and externally rotate the humerus, this draws the greater tuberosity away from the acromion, and it contracts, this is getting technical now, the long head of your tricep. Rotate the acromion toward the midline, away from that greater tuberosity. Essentially, you're providing more space. Combining the contraction of both these muscles creates space between the acromion and the greater tuberosity, assisting to prevent impingement there. If you contract these muscles to externally rotate the humerus, outward rotate the scapula, when performing postures involving overhead movements. All that's a very technical way of saying keep the shoulder down, keep a little space between where it's going to get impinged. Does that make sense now a little bit more? All right, back to where we were, page 30.
Just FYI, on 151, they show the teres minor and major.
Let's take a quick peek there. tolerance for that. Flip to page 36. This is where I jumped ahead a little bit. On the origin and the insertion, an agonist or prime mover and antagonist. Okay. So your proximal attachment of a muscle is the origin. So the origin of the hamstring muscles is the base of the ischium. The muscle attaches at the posterior femoral condyloids. Now this is Stan's hamstrings. Disregard the metal. Attaching or originating here, attaching or inserting down here. I believe it's on the medial side. Oh, Stan! You lost your pen? Oh, that was bad. You lost his pen.
Can't keep my head on straight.
I got that on video.
My job.
He's just all Do we need to turn them? Do we need to lay them down? Thank you. All right, I'll be a little bit more careful. It's so exciting. Right. Where were we? What happened now?
The origin.
Okay, we got the origin, the insertion. I talked about agonist, that's the technical term, and antagonist. We're going to refer to it, I think, target muscle. What is our target muscle? So if my target muscle engages the reciprocal muscle or antagonist, it's going to lengthen. Biceps and triceps are a good example. Quadriceps and hamstrings are a good example. They have technical definitions here. So the agonist or prime mover or target, a muscle that contracts to produce a certain action of a joint. For example, your hamstrings are agonist when you flex your knee. When I flex my knee, my hamstrings are contracting. When I extend my knee, my quadriceps are engaging, my hamstrings are relaxing or lengthening. So inversely here, the antagonist relaxes while the agonist or target muscle contracts. The antagonist produces the opposite action about a joint. We just listed that example. Quadriceps to the front of the thigh, or antagonist to the hamstrings when you flex your knee. When you extend your knee, the quadriceps is the agonist and the hamstring is the antagonist. Synergist, a muscle that assists and fine-tunes the action of the agonist and can be used to produce the same action, although generally not as efficient. Flipped one more page, and I think we're going to get to maybe a stopping point here soon. I don't spend a ton of time on muscle shapes, but you can see that they are equally diverse, if not more diverse than bone shapes. You see the SCMs that I mentioned the other night, the second page of the second picture in that bottom row, the sternocleidomastoid strap-like muscles. The latissimus dorsi, the big muscles that take up a broad part of that. Look how wide they are near the midline at the spine and how they converge. That's why they're called a triangular convergent muscle, up near and attach or insert there at the proximal edge of your humerus. We have the rectus abdominis. These are the ones that we call a six-pack, and we see, wow, there's a lot more going on than just 6 of them. There's this bulk, separate compartments, and they insert or attach down here, right on the front of the ischium here. So starting up at ribs, which rib that is. Up here, coming right down to there. And they are quite superficial. The most superficial of the abdominals. So we go a layer in, then we got those diagonally shaped obliques. Then we go a layer in below that, we got the transverse, which is what I was talking about the other night, was corset type muscle. Monoarticular, polyarticular muscles has to do with how many joints do they overlap and help facilitate movement in. A muscle that only corresponds to one joint is a monoarticular, whereas a polyarticular joint corresponds to more than one. So the iliopsoas, in the demonstration on page 39, it's coordinating the compressive joints down in the spine, lumbar spine, as well as the hip area, which is abducting, externally rotating, flexing. Page 41. Types of contraction. This is good to know for your own practice. Concentric contraction, also known as isotonic. I don't hear that quite so often. It sounds like something you might order in the bar when you're the DD. This means that it's shortening while maintaining constant tension through a range of motion. If you want to get really strong in the gym, work the muscle. Concentric, slow contraction all the way through that range of movement. Yeah, Ray's nodding. He knows what that feels like. Also, if you want to get big or strong, eccentric contraction. So all the way out of that movement, you still keep it short and around and be like, keep it engaged all the way out. That's going to really build up some strength there. And this is the example of the bicep, of course. Isometric. We use this when we mention it, and it probably took me years before I actually knew what I was saying, nonetheless doing, as a yoga practitioner and teacher. Isometric. Body basically stays in the same shape, fixed position, but the muscle generates tension. Like plank. Yeah, like plank, exactly. The muscle generates tension but does not move or shorten, thus the bones do not move or shorten. So we often say this, be very careful with you stand now, in poses like Sphinx Pose. Isometrically draw your forearms towards your hips. Did you see me move? No, but I did it, and I could feel it. And it created a little bit of traction and lengthening of my lower back, while also firming up my abdominals even a little bit more. So that's what isometric means. Oh, there's a hilarious book I highly, highly, highly recommend. Maybe when you're done with the training and you have free time to read again. It's Bill Bryson. Anybody read any Bill Bryson? He wrote, his most famous book is A Walk in the Woods, about him and a kind of hapless friend that he has hiking the Appalachian Trail. Pretty funny book, and Robert Redford later made a movie. I haven't seen that. I don't know if it's any good. But Bill Bryson writes another book, which is actually a memoir, called Life and Times of a Thunderbolt Kid, and talked about growing up in the 50s. And my wife and I think it's a hilarious book. He talked about his father getting into isotonics, I think was the name of it, which was kind of popular in the 50s. And that his father would do it, much to his dismay, when they were out in public, like at a place like the airport, and he'd be doing things like this. And people would be like, what's going on? That just made me think of that. Okay, the next page is important, you guys. 42 and 43, things you do need to know. Static stretching. Let's read it. Static stretching is the most common technique used in Hatha Yoga. There are two categories of static stretching. Active static stretching, and the other one is obviously going to be passive. Okay. Active static stretching involves contracting a target muscle. Or excuse me, contracting the antagonist muscle to stretch the target muscle. That's what we've been talking about. Engage your quadriceps to lengthen your hamstrings. That's active static stretching. Because our body's static. I'm not moving per se, other than my breath dynamics. And I could be lazy here, and that would be passive. Or I can activate and engage here to further lengthen. That's active static stretching. This is generally what you're teaching yoga. This is probably the most, this is, as I said, the most common. And this is what you're going to be doing. And that's how you get people to engage and stay focused in their postures. This is called reciprocal inhibition. You're going to need to know how to define that. Reciprocal inhibition seeing if in my notes I had a really great definition other than theirs. Well, is the engagement of an antagonist muscle to more deeply stretch / relax the target muscle.
Engagement of the antagonist.
Antagonist, and you can come up with your own words for this, but yeah, the engagement of the antagonist muscle to more deeply stretch and relax the target muscle.
Does this have more to do with the nervous system than the muscle?
That's a great question. I think it probably applies to both. Definitely applies to the muscular system, but I think it probably does apply to the nervous system too. And of course, your breathing is the most important thing for the nervous system. But it probably targets, because I'm engaging here, I don't need to engage there. A little bit nervous, That's why I say relax. Probably the stretching aspect of it is actually what's happening muscular system-wise, and that relaxation component might be more of the nervous system's response too. You don't need to know how to give examples. We've already talked about biceps and triceps, quadriceps and hamstrings are good examples, but there's more than that. Let's see if we can maybe come up with this one. What muscles am I engaging right between my shoulder blades? Very good. Rhomboid muscles, right in between the shoulder blades, right here and here. As I contract those muscles, what's happening? What are the reciprocal muscles? Stretching out the pectorals or chest. Exactly. That's a pretty common thing that we do in yoga too. We often draw the shoulder blades down a little bit and inward a little bit to get more expansion here. That's called active static stretching, aka reciprocal inhibition. Most common technique used in yoga. Now, passive static stretching occurs when we relax into a stretch, using only the force of the body, weight, or maybe an externally applied weight like a sandbag or something, to stretch a muscle. And they have an example right there of supported bridge. There's two styles of yoga that utilize passive static stretching. We teach them here at Bree. Who knows them? Yin and restorative. So that's what you need to know about passive static stretching. Yin and restorative yoga. And we'll talk about this at the end of our day-to-day around your guys' requirements for classes. Primarily, you're going to be taking active static yoga classes, but we want you also to take a handful of passive static yoga classes because they're complementary. There's times in our lives where physically, physiologically, and so on, we need to be passive. I have also seen the flip side of that a lot of people who are very attracted to yin yoga need a little bit of active static engagement in their lives. But there are certainly a lot of people who have plenty of that in their lives, and they need some passiveness too. And yoga can provide the balance. They say, Ayurveda is a sister science that grew up with yoga. Ayur means life, and Veda means science. The science of life. And this is a holistic approach. It's medicine, holistic medicine basically, around learning about your constitution and basically learning to do the opposite of what you're drawn to do. For example, they could have put me in the poster for pitta dosha. Dosha means defect. I'm going way on a tangent, which you'll find that I do. Okay. Dosha means defect, but it doesn't mean that you're defective. It just means that that's your drum, that's your natural proclivity. I'm pitta. Pitta is fire. Red hair, fair skin, get hot, love spicy food. I love to exasperate my pitta nature by exercising hard, working out intensely, eating spicy food, and it all just makes it more. Gil, you need to eat cucumbers. No, I don't want to eat cucumbers. You eat cucumbers. You gotta cool this down a little bit. Gil, you need to do yin yoga. No, I don't want to do yin. You need to do some cooling, passive yoga. So the Ayurvedic Yoga Conference comes to Norfolk. And everyone who signs up for Power Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga, as soon as they walk in, the doors lock. And in comes Judith Hansen-Lassiter, passing out bolsters to everyone. Let me have it. They have to do passive yoga. Meanwhile, everyone who strolled in, the bolsters, sandbags, eye pillows, essential oil, ready for their 2-hour nap. In comes Baron Baptiste.
Wow.
Time for some power yoga. Let me out. This is the Ayurvedic Yoga Conference.
Wow.
That was fun.
Resonate? Okay.
Oh, now you know what to do next time. Which place is
Right.
Gil, is vinyasa the same as or similar to flow?
Vinyasa does mean flow, and branches of vinyasa are power
Okay.
and alike. Yeah, yes.
So opposite of obviously yin and sort of.
Exactly, yeah. Vinyasa is definitely active, static yoga, but it's also active dynamic too, because there's a lot of movement as well. But once we get into a pose like Warrior 2, this is an active pose. You're not doing a yin Warrior 2. You know what I mean? I have to engage in order to sustain this pose. Whereas yin and restoratives all tend to be closer to the ground so that we can let the weight of the body sink or rest onto support.
It's harder than you would think.
Which is not easy either.
No.
No, not easy
It's like
either.
you're screaming inside your head.
But are you going to
You've been
build
there for a while,
strength?
you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You'll maybe build mental strength, but are you going to build muscular strength in yin yoga?
No.
No, because it's just passively letting things stretch. There's not engagement. That's the opposite of what the concepts of yin are. We're trying to not engage. Our tendency is maybe to grip and control a little bit, and we're trying to soften all that.
So is that passive static?
Yes, that's passive static stretching in yin yoga. The difference between yin and restorative is that restoratives use props. In yin you might use some, but restoratives use lots of props to let the body come into a position where it can be completely at ease. And so, for example, and I have very little props up here right now. If I come into this reclined pose, it may feel okay for a few moments, even a few minutes, but eventually the tightness of these targeted muscles that I'm stretching in the inner thighs might start to cause like a shakiness. And particularly if I'm tighter, I would already probably feel that right away. And so in a restorative pose, I'm going to bring support underneath the structures of the body so that those muscles can just relax completely into the stretch. That's the concepts of restorative yoga.
And you stay there longer.
And you would stay there, yeah, much longer. Both yin and restorative, you tend to hold those poses over a period of time, 3 minutes or more.
I had a teacher that would make us hold for
6 minutes, yeah. It's not uncommon. In a yin pose, that can be intense, though, for sure.
And you're screaming.
Restorative is
inside your
usually
head.
not the
Well, that's why I'm
intense.
taking in now.
Not physical. Maybe mentally it's hard for a lot of people to be still. So I don't want to say that it's not intense. It could, any experience, anytime, anywhere, whether it's in the yoga classroom or outside, could be intense or not. It just depends. Someone who has PTSD, laying still, there could be some kind of trigger in any way, shape, or form. So just because it looks really nice on the outside doesn't necessarily mean that it's all rainbows and butterflies on the inside. Maybe it does feel lovely, but it could be intense too. So So I'm not discounting yin yoga. It's not my natural, it's not what I'm drawn to. And I also like to put in that disclaimer that you're not gonna build strength. So if you're, for example, an elderly student who wants to develop balance, you know, and you're worried about the fall that could break your hip kind of thing, okay, yin yoga is going to be healthy for your body to get you moving and so on, but it's not going to build the strength that you want for balance. You know, power vinyasa, if you're at an advanced age, is probably not the right practice for you either, but something that's a little bit more active than yin if you want to actually develop some balance and strength.
What do you mean advanced age?
I'm talking like, you know, 70s.
Okay.
Like if you had a student who came in,
Right.
you know, I'm 70, I noticed that my balance is a little off, you know, I'm looking for some yoga. You know, I wouldn't steer them away from yin altogether. Be like, okay, you know, some yin classes will help you stretch and you know, release some tension in connective tissue. But if you're wanting to develop some balance and body awareness control, then you need to do some active yoga too.
Yep.
I've had students, and I've experienced this myself, because I started to take a few yin classes in my first teacher training that I did, and my body felt like almost a little disjointed. You can overstretch your muscles and connective tissue. And the connective tissue, the tendons and ligaments I'm referring to, has a limited capacity to come back, but not as quickly as muscles. So you can overstretch. And I had a student a few years ago that went through our teacher training program, and as soon as she got through our teacher training program, she discovered yin yoga and got really into it and started to do a training and started practicing it very, very frequently. And then she came to me and she's like, "Gillian, I need to talk to you. Feeling like my knees are aching, and my body's just kind of achy." And I'm like, I had to just be kind of upfront. You're doing too much yin yoga. You don't need to do yin yoga 5 days a week, particularly if you're not doing anything to tighten up, to tone back up. Muscle tension is not a bad thing, just like we learned compression. It's not a bad thing to tense, to have tension in your body. A certain amount of tension holds our body in good form. And then we're strong enough to be resilient if we get a little bit off balance. Too much tension and we're tight and we can't straighten out, and you know, you can see it, you can feel it, and so on. So we do want a little level of tension. It's all about finding that balance between having some tension in the body and not too much. So, things in your life that are adding tension, if you work out regularly, if you do weightlifting or anything like that, okay, that's good. Balance it out with things that are going to help you release a little bit of the excess, like yoga. Got a lot of this going on, doing yin yoga all the time, laying on your couch. Do some things that are going to tone you up and develop some strength and balance. Right? The yin and the yang. So another way of looking at active yoga, right, is probably what we would call yang. Yang yoga, active, static yoga is yang, whereas passive, static yoga is yin. The yin and the yang. There's two more types of stretching, and then I think we will pause on our anatomy. Facilitated. A yoga practitioner uses facilitated stretching to deepen their postures. This type of stretching involves contracting the muscles being stretched during an active, static stretch. Let's use some so you can really know what I'm talking about. What's one of my favorite examples? Come into Baddha Konasana, aka bound angle pose. You can sit on a blanket if you'd like. Press the pinky side edges of your feet together. And then engage and push the pinky sides of your feet strongly into one another, like you're trying to grip a $1 bill or something. Do you feel these muscles engaging here? Okay, good. Hold it for a few more moments. Keep breathing. Sit up top. Keep that engagement. Set edges of your feet together. Deep breath. And as you exhale, let that engagement relax. You feel, even if it didn't actually physically move, the knees drift down. These muscles relax. You Feel it, Connie?
No, but I think it's because I had my hands on my knees, so I may have been.
You may have been,
interfering
yeah,
with-
okay. Try it again, even just for a second. Push the pinky side together. And relax that. So what we did was we engaged and contracted the very target muscles that we aim to stretch. And after we engaged them for a few minutes, they relaxed so much deeper because that's what they wanted to do. It's like fish swimming upstream. They don't normally want to swim upstream, so they get off into the eddies where they can be chill. Same thing. We're engaging. Our muscles don't want to stay engaged forever. They want to relax. So after we engage them intentionally for a few moments, they're going to relax naturally. That's the idea of a facilitated stretch. And so we do use that in yoga classes. More often, I use that as a teacher near the latter stages of the practice when we're moving towards relaxation and ease. So it's a pretty cool concept. Does everyone understand it? Did you be able to feel it? That's facilitated stretching. This is also known as PNF. You'll see that right in the middle of that paragraph. Proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. Sounds like it could be a fish song or something. It's important to consider the joint reaction forces when using facilitated stretches, since the force the muscle generates is transmitted to the joints. As a general rule, gently contract the stretched muscle to avoid excessive joint reaction forces. They use the example of your glute medius, that's your posterior butt area, and the tensor fascia lata. I think I ordered that once at Starbucks. They know what I'm talking about. And the last example, or the last type of stretching, dynamic stretching. This is what we use during vinyasa practice. We move repetitively, and we might go a little deeper and deeper each time. I did dynamic vinyasa with you guys this morning when I did this. Dynamic movement. We might have gone a little deeper and deeper each time we got into the warrior two. Likewise, when you're doing sun salutations, we're moving the body, building some heat, and over time that might help us loosen the hamstrings so our forward fold gets maybe a little deeper, maybe our back bend gets a little bit more expansive in the upward dog. And they say right here, if you do dynamic stretching earlier in the day, like the morning, it resets your rested muscle length for the day. It's good to do dynamic movement. And the bridge pulses also that I did, up and down and with the arms, that's dynamic movement. Helps stretch and loosen those muscles and reset the resting muscle length for the rest of the day. Good to do dynamic stretching early in the day, if possible. Questions about anatomy for now? How many bones are there in the body? 206, give or take. Some might have an extra or not. Yeah. How many muscles are there in the body?
500.
All right. She went from 280 to 500. Any other guesses? Come on, give me a guess. Is the price is right? Who wants to be a 501?
600.
Ah, we're getting warmer. 639. Yeah. The muscle system consumes the majority of our nutrition and oxygen. And that number 639 is approximate. What is our function of the skeletal system? Structure and support of the body. Anything else? Did you have another idea? It anchors the muscles, often offers additional protection. The structure right here, the rib cage, that's a nice protection for those internal organs. And also circulation does move through the center of the bones, living organs. The muscular system, what's its function? Movement of the body. Stability. Also circulation, circulates blood throughout the body. Good job. The muscular system in vertebrae is controlled through the nervous system. So some muscles, we didn't talk about this one, the cardiac muscle is autonomous. Thank you. Okay, one last thing. I know I said we're done with anatomy, but I do have one other thing. I didn't mention fascia. Fascia surrounds muscle, even is a little bit enmeshed in muscle and tendons in some cases. It's like the cobweb of the body, or some almost even refer to it as the glue of the body. Sometimes it can make up to about 30% of the muscle's mass even, but it also is responsible for about half, maybe a little less than, of a muscle's resistance. Fascia. It's not all bad, but what fascia does is it builds up. So say we had an injury, and we don't use the joint and the muscles around it. That fascia is going to start to build up, and then becomes more and more resistant. But we can move it around and we can break it up and loosen it up.
Scar tissue.
So scar tissue attributes to fascia as well. Yeah. There's a lot more information out there about fascia if you get fascinated by fascia and want to read or see videos on it. But basically, it's like connective tissue. And if you were to dissect a body, you'd almost, I think you would see it first overlaying a lot of the muscles. It's like this thin, literally almost like a cobweb-like thing. And it's part of the structural integrity, but it also can build up and create more resistance when you want to break it up and loosen it up. You can get extra credit if you'd like to write like a one-page report on fascia and bring it to the next weekend and tell us more about it. Okay, let's take a stretch break, bathroom break, tea break, whatever you need. We'll come back, we'll do some Sanskrit. How's everybody feeling about anatomy?
Great.
You feel better? Learn some things? Yeah.
Bones are fun.
Good.
Those are fun.
Any burning questions that I need to answer? Okay. Take a few minutes.